welcome today at CAC our colleague Nathan Zingleman, who's the coordinator of the Writing Center here at the college, The Right Place. And his topic today is the American tradition of othering, a perennial construct of nativism and xenophobia.
Good afternoon. Let me begin by saying that let me provide a little ethos on this and credibility about why I think I'm qualified to give a presentation on this subject. And I'll start with my roots. I grew up in a working class area, working class neighborhood. To use the term, I would consider many of the people there rednecks, per se, people, and you know the term. My dad, I would consider racist. He voted for George Wallace. He never hurt anyone, but he grew up with what he knew and what he was taught. And I had arguments as a young man with him, and a boy even. I have a wife who's from Mexico, and she's undocumented. So I have kind of knowledge of both worlds. I see what's going on with undocumented aliens. I also see what happens with the working class. I still have some of those individuals on my Facebook. I don't usually post or comment on anything. But let me begin with the title. And my title is The American Tradition of Othering, a Perennial Construct of Nativism and Xenophobia. Defining othering. Othering is a term created by Edward Said. He is a cultural theorist. And by othering, we mean classifying other people as intrinsically different because of their culture and their beliefs. So marginalizing over our history, when we marginalize people for being different, it's somehow in the mind of those individuals has justified doing things that we would not consider moral, or we wouldn't consider a good person doing that. So it also can be a critique of the way people are excluded by society. And here we have the little cartoon. We're a very tolerant society, but if you don't behave like us, you can go back to where you bloody came from. So that's kind of ironic, saying he's tolerant. These are some historical examples of outgroups, others, and slavery is the biggest, or one of the two biggest, and I'm not going to go in deep with real deep into slavery because the topic is well covered, but I am going to touch on a certain number of laws that came after slavery to kind of see that othering still goes on. And we have Native Americans, Irish Catholics, Eastern Europeans, all non-white ethnic groups from the Pacific Rim. And what I mean by that, it includes Asians, people from India, so any number of people, Hispanics, African Americans, Mormons, people of other faiths. You know, Mormons are one, but other people of other faiths as well. And the intellectually disabled. So these are all outgroups here at one time, have been outgroups. I want to touch on a little of the early history of our immigration here. Before 1640, there were approximately 20,000 English Puritans, some in Jamestown, some in the New England area. I actually looked at a study that did a new quantitative look at immigration and immigrants, and it determined by using some mathematical calculations and anecdotal evidence that 822,000 white immigrants arrived in the U.S. between 1607 and 1790. A lot of people will say to me, I hear them say, but we didn't have immigration laws back then. We've always had immigration laws, almost since the beginning of time. And one of the first ones was the Naturalization Act of 1790 that restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person who had been in the U.S. for 2 years. So we're already making distinctions at this time. From 1820 to 1870, 7.5 million immigrants came to the United States. There was an insatiable need for labor because of the railroad. There were the gold rushes in California and Colorado. Post-war immigration, we started to see a lot of people from Eastern Europe, from the Slavic nations, from Italy, and we started seeing racism against these individuals. And a lot of the famous writers actually wrote things, had things in their writing that I would consider racist today. Walt Whitman was a nativist. I haven't noticed any racism in his writing, but he did write for papers before he became famous as a writer. Walt Whitman, from everything we know, was probably gay. And one of the reasons I didn't include some of the other outgroups like the LGBT, the elderly, at some time or another, you know, they could be considered part of the out-group, but they also can be part of the in-group. Walt Whitman was part of the in-group because no one knew at that time, or maybe it was some people knew, but it wasn't just out there. So the new blocks of immigrants, the thirst for immigrants and labor was unquenchable. So defining nativism. So nativism is an idea created and defined by America asserting that the United States belongs in some way to the Anglo-Saxon race, and that it offers some interpretation of national greatness. Nativist outburst occurred northeast from the 1830s to the 1850s, primarily because of a surge in Catholic immigration. I always think it's kind of ironic that a lot of Catholics today are in some ways prejudicial or racist when during the 19th century they faced a lot of it themselves because of their beliefs, their religion. Nativism is rooted in the idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. And this has occurred over the years. And as we move through this PowerPoint, I'll show you some examples of that. A lot of writing was out there, a lot of laws that talked about racial, and this word here, we'll underline it every time, but it's actually a word that was coined by one of the writers. It's racial unassimilability, meaning they can't assimilate in society very well, or the government and other people, the nativists, believe that to be the case. So it was a new racial dogma of the late 19th and 20th centuries. And Higham is, he's a person who wrote this book, Strangers in the Land, Patterns of American Nativism from 1860 to 1925. This is a very interesting book if anyone wants to borrow it. And this is another book I used, Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and The Making of America. So these are very good books. They're not an easy read, but they're very good books. So nativism gained its popularity with parties of the 1840s and 50s. And what's so funny about it, they usually refer to themselves as Native Americans, which they're not. You know, they're Anglo-Saxons, and they claim most of English descent. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Gangs of New York, but where the English kind of oppress the Irish, and they battle over the right to be here. So nativism, therefore, can be defined as an intense opposition to the internal minority of its un-American distinctions. So this is not something I came up with. This is from different writing, different laws. These terms here are used. They were used in papers back in that time. The American Patriot was a nativist paper back then that was published throughout the 40s and 50s. And often they had dialogue that was very xenophobic. Who were the nativists? Employers often thought that non-whites may have problems like drinking, things like that. They attached stereotypes to different things. Social reformers who thought immigrants were weak, and that detract from society. Government officials who wanted a homogeneous society and believed that people of other colors and other races would dilute that homogeneous society, the Anglo-Saxon society. So native-born white workers, afraid of competition. This has went on throughout the centuries. We've had a thirst for labor in this country. When the railroads were built, at one time or another, with the gold rush, immigrants would come over from China. They would come from other nations. And then when the work died down, the American workers would get angry and place blame on the immigrant workers, the foreign workers. Have we heard that before? Yeah. It's very similar to what's going on today. Protestants were usually afraid of Catholics. They also hated the Mormons very much, even though the Mormons believed in Jesus. Their faith a little bit different, but we'll touch on the Mormons a little bit later. Racism, religious intolerance, and the rule of law. Whenever I hear someone talk about the rule of law, it always makes me cringe. You know, we need laws, right? But we have had so many intolerant or just vicious laws over the years that it's unthinkable. And we pass laws for convenience. As you'll see later on, our Supreme Court can be very biased. They're not always apolitical like they should be. They're real people, and they bring their own biases to the court. So some of these, this is Secondat is a French philosopher. There is no greater tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of the law and in the name of justice. So these are some of the laws and initiatives we're going to look at. And I'll go through them if you would just want to read over them real quick. I'll flip through and not name them all off right now. So the doctrine of discovery wasn't a law, but it was religious dogma. And basically, the first settlers here used that to take the natives' land. You know, if you weren't a Christian, you were somehow inferior and you didn't believe in you didn't follow the Christian faith, then it was somehow okay to take their land. And especially since most Europeans thought they could put it to better use and use it more efficiently. Within 20 years of Columbus's landing, and Columbus has been one of our heroes over the years. We still celebrating Columbus Day. But I have a different view of Columbus. Yeah, he did come to America, but he came to America for profit. He wasn't he wasn't trying to change the world or anything. Within 20 years of Columbus's landing, 8 million Native Americans perished. Now, most of those were from disease. Disease was rampant. They didn't have immunity, but a lot of them perished from violence from the Anglo-Saxon settlers. Over 10 million Native people lived in the U.S. in 1492. By 1900, less than 225,000 people remained. So that's the number of Native Americans they could count. Now, there may have been some mixed in communities who weren't full Native Americans, but that's what they counted on the reservations. So one of my books, I didn't have it with me, but it's called American Holocaust. It's by a Native American historian. He's not Native American. His name is David Stannard, but most of his writing is about Native Americans. And he used quantitative studies and things like that, and looked back at a lot of the Native American, what was available from their stories, whatever pictorial evidence there was, some of the evidence of writing. The Cherokees actually had language and wrote a lot of stuff down. They were the civilized tribe, they were educated, and we'll talk about the Cherokees in a minute. This is just an image of what would be probably Native Americans dying from disease, could be from an attack. The legacy, and we call him Old Hickory. The Cherokees called him Sharp Knife. Sharp Knife is Andrew Jackson. And the Cherokees called him Sharp Knife because of the atrocities and the things he did to them when he was a general, and after even orders he passed down after he became president. So Jackson's steadfast belief in racial inferiority fueled his early career as a slave trader. He wasn't just a slave owner. Jackson was a slave trader. He actually ran ships and transported the slaves. He bought his plantation with that money. He usually had 150 slaves on his plantation. He had 300 over his lifetime that the historians talk about. This is an ad from a Tennessee publication right here. And if you notice, he's offering a $50 reward for an escaped slave. But what I found intriguing about this, if you look down here, he offers an extra $10 for every 100 lashes any person performs up to 300 lashes. So he's saying, $10 for 100 lashes up to 300. So he'll give them $30 if they give the slave 300 lashes. For me, this is actual evidence. This is not fake news. This came out of an actual publication. Andrew Jackson published this. So he supervised the mutilation of more than 800 Creek Indian corpses. 300 occurred during the Red Stick War. The Battle of Horseshoe Creek, I believe it is, 300 were killed there. But what Andrew Jackson, he wanted to preserve the evidence, so he had his soldiers cut their noses off and take strips of skin off of the dead Native Americans and make bridles out of the skin. This is recorded in several, it's not just in one historical account, it's recorded in several. Jackson perfected the practice of ethnic cleansing by ordering troops to systematically kill Indian women and children after massacres to complete the extermination. Now, Jackson is an unusual character. He did adopt a Native American child after they wiped out one tribe, and I hear he cared for his family a lot. But we see that a lot with people who do bad things to other people. They care for their family, but they somehow make other people lesser. They marginalize it, and in their mind, it's justifiable to do horrible things to them. So this is a quote in the Standard Book. The women, as they were fleeing with their babes, were killed together, shot right through, and the women who were very heavy with child were also killed. So this is a quote that was drawn down. The Standard got from the Creek. The Creek also had writing available. They were one of the 5 civilized tribes. During his time in office, and this reminds me of something here, but I always wonder why we consider him a great president. And a lot of it was because of the way he was. He was a great general, great warrior, but what did he actually do as president? During his time, this time in office, that should be his time, Jackson vetoed 12 bills, more than his 6 predecessors combined. In 8 years, Congress only passed one major law, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, at Jackson's request. So in 8 years, he only passed one law. And that was this law that he asked for. And we're going to talk about that, look at that. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. So basically 2,000 to 4,000 Cherokees died on the Trail of Tears. Most of us have heard of the Trail of Tears. The Cherokees were a very civilized tribe, and they assimilated very well. They had their own language, and they learned English as well, how to write English. Most of them became Christians. I'll show you a photo of them in just a minute. That is a photo that either came from their last days in Georgia or their early days in Oklahoma. Sharp Knife carried out his actions against the Native Americans despite the fact that the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. The Cherokees took this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled it unconstitutional to remove them from their land. But Jackson said, John Marshall has made his decision. He was the Chief Justice. Now let him enforce it. So he just ignored the Supreme Court order and went on and did. That again, to me, when I hear people say the rule of law, the rule of law has been played with over the years, and you'll see more of this as we move through. We're just now touching on it. The 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole Indians. The Cherokee Indians provide an excellent example of a Eurocentric mentality that led to the annihilation of Native Americans by the 20th century. This is a photo of the Cherokee. I am actually around an 8th Cherokee. I'm not someone that just says that. There's been a genealogy trace done by one of my aunts. My great-grandmother on one side was half Cherokee, and my great-grandmother on another side, on my paternal side, also had Cherokee. The one on my maternal side, they did the genealogy trace. My aunt actually visited the reservation, the Cherokee Nation reservation. But this is basically the way Cherokees looked during the time of their removal. They lived in cabins. They wore dresses, suits. They were very civilized. They cultivated, they had agriculture, they raised crops. But Jackson said they found gold in Georgia on the land, so Jackson said they had to leave or be annihilated, that they would be killed. And so they moved them off on the Trail of Tears. This is in California, surprisingly, as liberal as California is now, California has a history. The California Act for the Government and Protection of Indians in 1853. I highlighted Act and Protection in red because it's so ironic. Whites could request the court to remove Indians from lands in the white person's possession. So basically, the settlers could move on their land, set up, and then they could ask the court to take the land away from the Native Americans. Any non-Indian could petition a court to obtain Indian children for indenture. If the court determined that no coercion occurred, then a person could obtain a certificate granting custody and control of any earnings of said child until the age of 18. They also did this with adults. If an adult Native American had a minor crime like drinking, public drunkenness, they could, to pay off their fine, they would indenture them for a year or 2 years, which was an interesting read as well. In no case could a white man be convicted on the testimony of an Indian. This was in the Act. This is an actual law, and these facts here were stated in the law. They're on public record. If you ever want to look them up, I'll show you something else that was a law later on. I actually have a copy of it showing that will be very interesting. So, the Plains Indians. So, the Plains Indians, if you've seen The West by Ken Burns, it's a very interesting movie. I did most of my research through Monographs books. Discovery of gold in California, in Colorado brought thousands of white settlers across the plains. The thing about the white settlers too is they brought disease with them. Half the Northern Cheyenne died from cholera, half of them. Many of the other tribes, the Blackfoot tribe, were wiped out by smallpox. So it was basically germ warfare. Now I haven't found any evidence that measles blankets were actually given. They say in Canada with Chief Pontiac, maybe that happened, but with here, there's no real evidence. Now they did keep food away on reservations, do other things. They broke over 500 treaties with the Plains, with Native Americans all together, not just the Plains Indians. The Treaty of 1851 forced the Arapaho and Cheyenne to cede most of their land to the whites. It also gave land to the Lakota, the Sioux Indian, because they were in the Black Hills. But 3 years later, the Lakota were removed. One of the tribal members accidentally shot a cow, and a force of men went to the reservation. And Conquering Bear, the chief who actually signed the treaty, they were in an argument there, and they argued for 45 minutes, and the commander just ordered the men to open fire, and there were 30 men. They killed Conquering Bear. The Indians or Native Americans in turn attacked them. They wiped out all 30 of them. So the Treaty of Laramie was broken. This led to the Battle of Bighorn and the entire story of that. The ethnocentrism of European cultural superiority marginalized them in the eyes of white settlers. When the Indians were starving, and I found an interesting quote, and a lot of times after the buffalo, on many occasions after the buffalo were exterminated, the Indians didn't have anything to eat. They didn't provide them the food. The agents didn't provide them the food they needed. They had a comment or a quote from one of the white settlers that said, "Let them eat grass." Again, we see the marginalization of someone who's different, who's someone they consider a savage, someone less than human. General Sherman and Sheridan accelerated the annihilation of the Plains Indians through the deliberate slaughter of the buffalo. They had, a lot of it was done by professional hunters, but Sherman and Sheridan encouraged this. I actually found a journal article investigating this. They did research. They were trying to determine whether General Sherman was actually complicit in this, and it's in my reference page at Smith's. They found, yes, that he was. They looked at all the evidence. They did it in a very covert way. Sometimes the soldiers would shoot them. They would encourage, they offered bounties to professional hunters to kill them. So they could eventually wipe out the buffalo. And this is some more evidence. Interesting enough, I found some monographs or books that were written back in the 90s where they were trying to say this wasn't true, that cattle-borne diseases wiped out the buffalo. And so they were trending against. But the evidence has trended back. There's so many photos and images of this. Do you know what this is? That is a mountain of buffalo heads. And you see the guy standing on top, that's how high. And there wasn't just one. These are hides here. I also found photos of buffalo carcasses laying out on the plains with just their skins stripped off. If you read the quote, this was a colonel under Sherman. He said, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." So this is an actual quote, a historical quote. The Dawes Act. So the Dawes Act came in 1887. This is another law. So this basically took away communal ownership from the Native Americans, the Indians. You know, they had their reservation, their tribe. So they decided to take away the communal ownership. They would grant each head of household 160 acres. If you were single, you would get something like 40 acres. U.S. citizenship would be conferred upon Indians who abandoned their tribes and adopted the habits of civilized life. So again, we're othering another culture, making their culture less than what ours is. All land not allotted reverted to the control of the U.S. government and could be sold. Consequently, land owned by Indians decreased from 138 million in 1887 to 48 million acres in 1934. It decimated Native American culture because they broke their land up into plots, but they started selling it off. So this is a handbill. This is an actual handbill. This is another policy, an Eisenhower era policy. So they decided in 1953 that the Indians should assimilate. They should blend in with civilized people with a civilized life. So this policy began the effort of the government's effort to eradicate the Indian tribes. And by eradicate mean not kill them, but break them up as tribal communities. It pressured for the assimilation of Native Americans. The Supreme Court held that Congress had the power under the Commerce Clause to terminate a tribe. So terminate a tribe means take their tribal status away. A lot of tribes lost their tribal status during this time. Some of you may remember the Native American protests during the 60s when they were out in the streets. 90 million acres of Indian land were sold to non-Indians. And if you notice this handbill right here, this was aimed at Anglo-Saxons, civilized people, or what they term people living non-Native Americans. So get a home of your own, easy payments, perfect title, possession within 30 days, fine lands in the West. So they basically advertised their land and sold it off. Again, and that was a policy, it was an initiative, but initiatives sometimes can be just as bad as law, sometimes worse. The genesis of nativist attitudes towards immigrants in America. So I'm going to shift it a little bit towards immigrants. The early America anti-foreign political sentiment began to take shape around 1835. Americanism was based on the principle of nationality. The ideology upheld and vindicated on the basis of self-preservation. The ideological core of nativism is rooted in nationalism, and we see that again today. The concept that the United States belongs in some special sense to the Anglo-Saxon race. If we do not think that still exists, it's there. And Charlottesville was proof of that. Racism still exists. Because of my experience with my family and growing up and being around people from this class, I recognize racism, even covert racism. I can see it when someone makes a statement. Oh, I watch the political pundits talk and argue, and I watch the right and the left argue. On Channel 26, one of the more left-leaning argued that how come the police keep shooting African Americans or black people? Wayne Docefino, a news person there, says, well, maybe they should quit robbing stores and committing crimes. He stereotyped them. To me, he may not overtly be racist, but that was a fairly racist statement to me.
What town are you from? What state are you from?
I'm a native-born Texan. My family goes back deeper than it also gets me when someone has a Confederate flag that says, heritage, not hate. I had family members, one I know of served in the Civil War. I do not have a Confederate flag because I know what it means to other people. And my roots in Texas go back in Austin. The Germans have been there for years. In East Texas, my Irish and Cherokee Indian roots go back before the Civil War. And that's where one of the Irish individuals was in the war. So one of my consultants, he's from Michigan. Well, his mother is from Michigan and his dad's from Arizona. And he says he has a Confederate flag in his car. I said, why? I said, your family's not even from here. And you say heritage, not hate? What is your heritage? One of the other consultants said, he's a Texan. I would even argue that. Yeah, he's born here. I guess he can claim it. But he doesn't have the heritage. And even though I have the heritage, I'm not going to put a Civil War flag up. Because the Civil War flag was raised again after the Civil Rights Bill was passed. It was raised as a symbol of hate. And a lot of these statues, although, I don't know, maybe they should move some of them to museums or something, but a lot of these statues were put up years after the Civil War in areas where racism was rampant, not because of heroes. Now, my mom and her sister owned a costume shop, and the Daughters of the Confederacy would come in and have their ball. They have heritage, their family, and they would celebrate it, wear the clothes. That's heritage there. They would do it on their own, in their own area. To me, if they want to do that, that's fine. But you shouldn't be displaying things that may be offensive to other people. Jacqueline probably sees a Confederate statue much differently than I do, right? To you, it means it has a different meaning.
Well, for me, because I have family members from all nationalities, when I see a Confederate flag, I personally don't take it as racism because I know there's a historical behind it that even.
Yeah, it's not always.
So for me, when I see one, I look at it as though I wonder what their story is.
Yeah, it's not always, but more cases than not.
More cases than not.
When I see someone with heritage, not hate on their pickup truck, they probably don't even know what their heritage is.
So you do see that some people support but don't know what it is.
These are, and xenophobia is the fear of foreigners. And these are a couple of handbills that were out. And I thought this was interesting. No Irish, no blacks, no dogs. Not just because of what it says, but who they grouped them with. They grouped blacks and Irish with dogs, and, to me. And here, again, this is a British historian who actually posted this quote. Sometimes he goes by Edward Freeman, I think. America would be a great land, and I'll let you read the rest of it. Again, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. When people tell me we had no immigration bills back then, they are completely wrong. And most of them were very oppressive. The Chinese Exclusion Act banned people from China and most of the Pacific Rim from immigrating to this country or becoming citizens. It absolutely excluded them. Are we hearing some of the same rhetoric today? No Japs in our schools. Look at the time period on these. We blame the entire war in World War II. They attacked Pearl Harbor. And I have some friends. I have one older friend that served in all three wars. The World War II, he's 90 years old. He served in World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And he's a great man, a very nice man. But things I've read about, what the Japanese did was wrong. They shouldn't attack. But I read things, and it's just conspiracy theory stuff. But we did stuff to antagonize them. We banned their people from immigrating here. We banned land ownership in different areas. Again, with the Chinese, the same thing. If you see the actual date on this is from the Historical Society in Tacoma, Washington. Prejudicial California law. So the California Alien Land Act of 1913 basically prohibited Asians or Japanese specifically from owning land in California. The Japanese had migrated to California. They took the land that wasn't the most desirable land and they made it work. But again, jealousy, othering, they looked and said, well, these, they're taking this land and making something of it. When the Anglos complained, they passed a bill. The California Alien Land Law of 1920 actually just reinforced this law and took a lot of the loopholes out of it. So both laws were upheld in the Supreme Court in 1923. So again, racism has been upheld by the Supreme Court several times, and later on we'll see maybe the worst case of that. In 1946, the Supreme Court of California reaffirmed the 1923 decision. The Johnson-Reed Act. The Johnson-Reed Act is another law that just reinforced the Chinese Exclusion Act. It included more groups from the Pacific Rim. People from India were barred from coming over here. They couldn't naturalize as a citizen. So if you see here, it placed quotas on other people of certain origin. People from the Pacific Rim were completely banned from immigrating to the United States. It increased illegal immigration by means of the Mexican and Canadian border. They had less stringent immigration laws after this was passed. Many Chinese died in the desert of the Southwest trying to reach the American dream. They would come into Mexico and then try to pass the border. So it's very interesting to see it. And we see this happening today with a lot of Hispanics dying in the desert. My wife has seen people dead in the desert, and in the Rio Grande River. The Supreme Court upheld the law, ruling that those who this is very interesting too. So this is a law of exclusion, but what the Supreme Court ruled, that that those who are not citizens of the land, who have been excluded, have no rights. They can't use our Constitution as an argument. So basically they argued, if you're a foreigner, you don't have American citizens' rights, so we can exclude you. So basically used the Constitution as a form of racism. Don't get me wrong, the Constitution is a great thing, but when you interpret it, you can interpret it in many ways. The original Constitution or Declaration of Independence talked about white men, and it was mostly white men back then, but I don't think that was an accident. So manifest destiny is another, the belief in the inevitable territorial expansion of the boundaries of the United States westward to the Pacific. So this is what gave us the right to move, take Texas, take California, Arizona, parts of Utah. So today many people view all Hispanics as immigrants. When I hear people talk that don't know, they say, oh, if they're Hispanic, they have to be immigrants. That's not true. In California, Texas, and New Mexico, there were Mexicans living in these states, cultivating them years before. And some of them are still here, but you'll see what happened to a lot of them after the different skirmishes. Polk actually went down, and this came from a book talking about it's in my reference page, the relationship with Mexico over the years, and Polk basically went down there and started a war because Mexico refused to sell New Mexico and California. They tried to buy it. So they sent a small force over the border and antagonized the Mexicans into attacking them. And then that gave them the excuse to start a war and take those states. So under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, Mexico ceded 525,000 square miles to the United States, including the land that makes up all of our parts of present day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. Some of these states here, like Utah, it's part of the state, not all of it. But it was a large section of land, very huge. I hear the argument, it was a different time back then, the right of conquest, a lot of people were, yeah, that's true. But if we don't know what our past is, we can't change who we are. If we keep believing that we don't have this past of othering, we can't change who we are today. And I see what's been under the surface for years has come to the surface recently. The persecution of Hispanics after the U.S.-Mexican War in March 1848, there were roughly 150,000 Native Americans, 6,500 Spanish or Mexican descent, people of Mexican descent known as Californios, and fewer than 800 Anglo-Americans in the California territory. What started the gold rush of 1849 brought 150,000 to 200,000 Anglo or Americans, they referred to themselves as Americans, to California. It also brought a lot of Asians from primarily Chinese to California searching for gold. Although the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo formerly protected the legal rights of Mexicans, now part of the United States, legal challenges deprived most Hispanics of their land. Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was one of California's first senators. He pushed for California statehood. He wanted California to be part of the United States, but after it happened, squatters, miners and squatters started moving on his land. He owned approximately 500,000 acres. They moved on his land. Squatters actually arrested him in his own house. This is a quote for him: "The North Americans hate us, consider us unworthy to form one nation, one society." Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. So they basically, when he died, he had 300 acres. So this is an actual photo of him. Josefa Segovia, also known as Juanita, is the only woman to be hanged in California. And when it's a person, it's hanged. When it's an object, it's hung. She was hanged in California. She was one of the native Californians of Mexican descent. One night, a minor drunk crawled into her bedroom. She found a knife on her, I guess, her table next to it, and she stabbed him. The next day, they refused to listen to her, and they hung her. And one newspaper person wrote, she wasn't hanged for her guilt. She was hanged for her Mexican blood. And so it's just another example. How many of you know about the town of Seguin, Texas? Juan Seguin was one of the heroes of the Alamo. He's actually the only person to escape with the message to Sam Houston. And from what I read, the reason he was used is because they thought he could move through the lines. So he also led the Tejano group at the Battle of San Jacinto. He was heroic in battle. He made sure that the remains of the Alamo defenders were buried with high honors. He was falsely accused of being loyal to Mexico later, betrayed by Anglo-Americans. This is an actual quote for him. I have become a foreigner in my own land, forced to seek refuge with my enemies, once again. So they ran him out of Texas on the threat of death. He later came back, I think, after the U.S.-Mexico War, but I don't know what eventually happened to him. It says those Tejanos who remained in Texas often found their livestock and corn stolen. Others had their land taken into dispute. So they were basically harassed, run out. Again, it's a case of othering. Mexican repatriation. This happened during the Great Depression and after. Mexican repatriation was an initiative in the southwestern and western states from 1920 to 1950, which focused on expelling Mexicans who did not fit the image of an American. So because they didn't look Anglo, they were expelled. Almost 2 million individuals were illegally deported to Mexico, and what that means, it's estimated that almost 60% or more of these 2 million people were actually citizens born here in the United States. So 1.2 million American citizens, a lot of them children, were deported because of the way they looked. And these are actual photos and flyers from the time. If you read it, Great Depression, Mexicans keep going, we can't take care of our own, you know, the decade of betrayal, the 1930s, and it went on after that. And they lined them up. Sometimes they deported them, other times they intimidated them into leaving. This is where I copied a portion. I was talking about the other bill earlier. Actually, you can find this bill online, and it's the Apology Act of 2005, issued by the state of California, this California legislature. So this is an Apology Act they issued. They admitted what they did. They admitted it was wrong. California is at least owning up to some of the things they've done in the past. Operation Wetback. I bet most of you didn't know where the term wetback came from, right? It came from an initiative here that was started by our government. ICE was involved. It was an Eisenhower-era initiative, but it went on up into the 60s. Undocumented people were removed to distant locations, often without food and water. This is how they did it. So I read an article in Opposing Viewpoints where a Marine wrote that he wrote, it isn't that we can't deport the 11 million here, it's that we don't have the will. By will, what he means is we need to remove all our moral and ethical character, right? What they did is they took them, rounded them up, and just dumped them across the border without food or water in all areas across. Some of them were from Central America. They didn't dump them close to their homes, no food or water, and a lot of them died. You know, this is something else you can look up. There's a lot of documentation about it. Even not as many with repatriation, but occasionally U.S. citizens of Hispanic origin were removed. They didn't exactly check people. If you were a child and a citizen, they didn't check that. Persecution of other religions. Again, it's not just your ethnicity, it's what your beliefs are. So the exodus of the Mormons were basically run out of at least 4 different states, New York, Ohio, Illinois, and Missouri. These were the last 2 states right here, Illinois and Missouri. The Missouri Executive Order 44, also known as the Extermination Order, was issued by the governor, Lilburn Boggs. So he basically told them, if you don't leave the state, we're going to kill all of you. And it was written in an executive order. You know, it wasn't just a statement. While in jail, Joseph Smith, their prophet, was killed by an anti-Mormon mob. It was a huge mob, maybe several hundred. They identified 5. They brought them in, but they never charged them with anything. One was a militiaman, so you can find out who they were, those 5. Their names are on record. After Brigham Young took them to Utah, and Utah was very desolate, Salt Lake, he started Salt Lake City, he became the governor of Utah. James Buchanan, the next president, the president after Andrew Jackson, who was personally endorsed by Andrew Jackson, removed him from office, or actually selected another governor for Utah without telling Brigham Young about it. So even after they went out and started their own society, it was taken from them because the Dred Scott decision. Okay, Chief Justice, so I'll move through this quick. We're getting close. The court held that Scott was someone who petitioned the court that he was in a free state. He should be, he shouldn't be a slave. The Supreme Court ruled that he was not considered a person. He was a property of the owner. These 2 states were Wisconsin and Illinois, not slave states. So, an interesting fact, 5 of the 9 justices were from the South. Another, Richard Greer of Pennsylvania, was staunchly pro-slavery. So we see our court can be biased. Maybe it's better today than it was back then, but they've held up many oppressive immigration laws. Mandated the Jim Crow laws, mandated segregation, made African Americans use, and Mexicans in some areas, use separate bathrooms, facilities, buses. A lot of states prohibited interracial marriage. I thought this was an interesting little cartoon. Alabama's passed some very restrictive laws saying the kids can't go to school there if they're, so it says whites only here, and then here it says no Latina. Jim Crow is dead, long live Jim Crow. So, very interesting cartoon. Let me kind of move through this a little bit. Eugenics. Eugenics is an American legacy. It wasn't started in Nazi Germany. Probably the father of our eugenics movement is Charles Davenport. Compulsory sterilization laws were adopted by 30 states that led to more than 60,000 sterilizations. Various studies revealed that Indian Health Service sterilized between 25 and 50% of Native American women between 1970 and 1976. So this was recent. Class and race factored in the eugenic definitions of fit and unfit. Many African American women were sterilized as well. 1911, the Carnegie Institute report explored 18 methods for removing defective genetic attributes, and method number 8 was euthanasia. The Euthanasia Society of America was founded in 1938. Now, they never put euthanasia into practice like they did sterilization, but they thought about it. More on eugenics. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program. It even funded the program that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. Hitler studied American eugenics laws. Nazis used the term Aryan race. Americans used the term Nordic race. The Nazi agenda was strengthened by the published works of American eugenics movement as the intellectual underpinnings for its social policies. The Nazis, when proposing their sterilization program, specifically noted the success of sterilization laws in California, documented most notably by American eugenicist Popenoe, I guess, maybe French, I'm not. Carrie Buck, Supreme Court. Oliver Wendell Holmes is one of our Supreme Court heroes, great writer. He upheld several of the immigration laws, restricted. He also ruled that that it didn't violate Carrie Buck's rights to sterilize her. She was a little bit below average in intelligence, so someone who was they considered intellectually disabled or even just slightly below intelligence, they would often sterilize. North Carolina sterilized a lot of people. It was one of the worst states. So they ruled that it did not violate the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. So again, the Supreme Court upheld an oppressive law.
Can you wrap it up?
Yeah, so the recent study indicated they tested different subject groups to see if ethnocentrism was directed against any groups in particular. They determined that Latinos today are viewed very ethnocentrically. Also, Asian triggered the second highest. And it's an outgroup schema. This is a quote from Abraham Lincoln. This is where I'll end it, and I'll let you read it yourself. This is a letter he wrote to Joshua Speed. And Joshua Speed was a slave owner. Especially notable is the last quote: "When it comes to this, I should prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty. To Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy." And if you see here, when they talk about the know-nothings up here, they say all men are created equal except Negroes, and they go into except Negroes, foreigners, Catholics. So
When did Lincoln write that? Do you know?
I would have to look it up. It was before he was president. It was in 1850, around 1853 or something like that. So Joshua Speed was an acquaintance. Abraham Lincoln was against slavery, but you get the arguments that to keep the Union together, he was pro-Union first, but he was personally against slavery, and he declared the Emancipation Proclamation, after the war started. But I watch a lot of documentaries. I like the Ken Burns, the Civil War, and things like that. And yeah, there were states' rights involved, but there was racism too, if you look at some of the quotes in the Civil War. I just wanted to kind of inform people. I feel this is my references. If we don't know who we are, where we came from, what we've done in our past, this has been sanitized in American history. Only recently have facts been coming. Did you see very many things up there you didn't know about? I'm betting quite a few, right? Because they don't publicize it. They don't write about it. You may, if you're a graduate student in history or have a PhD in history, you might know about it. But most of it we don't make publicly known, except maybe we talk about slavery, we talk about the Native Americans a little bit. For years, Hollywood stereotyped Native Americans and Hispanics too with sombreros. All Hispanics don't wear sombreros, just like all Texans don't wear cowboy boots and hats. So, that's it.
Thank you.
Yeah.